The thing in the wreck's hold had been cold for 3 years, and it was not the component. Hari Rao crouched in the dark, his cracked diagnostic tool glowing soft amber against the inside of an opened inheritance housing, and looked at the small Vask-marked vial somebody had been keeping alive in there since before his license came through. He swore once quietly in the standard way. His contract did not mention the vial. 3 days earlier, on Reach Orbital 16, Hari of Six Voices walked into the contractor lounge. That was the part Hari should have paid attention to. Brokers sent messages. Brokers sent encrypted slates with their seals on them and a deadline at the bottom. Brokers did not walk 50 meters of unpressurized service corridor and step through the lounge airlock with their harness still smelling of the outside vacuum. Especially not Hari, whose harness alone was worth more than the Orbital's whole bay crew put together. Contract bands dense across the upper carapace, and the 6-bead chain catching the lounge's bad amber light. The chain was the part that meant something, if you knew Suul. Erie's people carried their dead mentors with them, not as ghosts, but as memory. Fragments of the brokers who had trained them, folded into something a Suul could still consult, like advisors who had never quite left the room. The name said how many. Hari of Six Voices meant 6 of them, which meant senior. A young Suul went by 1 voice, or 2. Hari had done enough business across that counter to know the 6th was the newest. A broker who had run human accounts before dying into Erie's memory, and who, Erie had once let slip, found the things humans did with broken equipment more interesting than the trade strictly rewarded, which was probably why Erie kept handing Hari the strange jobs. Hari had never decided whether that was a compliment. Hari had been working through a synthetic glass of something the Orbital called whiskey, watching a docking arm fail in slow motion through the lounge viewport. The arm had been failing for a week. The bay crew kept patching it. The patches kept failing. It was, in his professional opinion, the kind of repair that was going to either fix itself or kill somebody, and it was the Orbital's job to decide which. He had not been looking for a contract. He had a contract. It was finishing. He had 2 days off coming, and he intended to spend them sitting in this exact chair. Suul had no eyes a human could meet, just a faceted band wrapping the head where a face should be, taking in the whole room at once. You knew Hari's attention had settled on you when the band stopped roving and held. It roved the lounge now and held on Hari.
Mr. Rao, I have come because the slate form was insufficient for the courtesy this conversation requires.
That's a hell of an opener, Hari.
It is. Will you sit with me?
It was not a question. He sat with Erie. The contract Hari laid out, 3 days before everything went sideways, in a contractor lounge that smelled like recycled air and burnt synthetic broth, was a simple one. There was a Vask crude transport adrift in disputed accord territory, dead 9 months and untouched for the last 6. Hari's Clade had paid a Charn arbitration office for first recovery rights on a single inheritance refrigeration component in its component bay. The rights expired in 48 hours. After that, the accord would reopen the wreck to a different broker. The component was a stasis-class unit, small, old. Hari's Clade wanted it intact and inert. The recovery fee, applied against Hari's outstanding contract obligation, would retire 47% of his debt. He read the slate 3 times. 47%.
Well, why are you bringing this to me, Hari?
2 reasons, of which the first will satisfy the second only partially. The Clade required a contractor who would accept the schedule. You will accept the schedule. My 6th voice required a contractor who would, when surprised, be useful. You are, when surprised, useful.
He looked at Erie for a long moment.
Tell your 6th voice. That's not as flattering as you think it is.
My 6th voice will receive your sentiment with the consideration it deserves.
He took the contract. The transport had a Vask name on its hull plate, in glyphs Hari could not read. Underneath the glyphs, somebody, long ago in standard ship paint, had stenciled the registry number in compact standard. The registry was a Vask trade cartel, A small one. The number ended in a year, 53. The ship had been in service 9 years before whatever killed it. It was floating in a slow tumble against a smear of 3 dim suns. The Accord arbitration beacon was still pinging from its hull, half power, patient. Hari brought his cutter in close, magged it to the dorsal plating, suited up, and walked over. The airlock cycled on the Vask system without arguing. Either the crew had left it unsecured or somebody had been here before him and not bothered to lock up after. He set that thought aside for later. Inside, the lights were dead. Power was out everywhere except, somewhere deep, a faint, steady draw that his cracked tool registered as below the threshold of any system that should still be live. Stasis-class component, doing its quiet work. The Vask transport was small. He found his way through it on his shoulder lamp in dead reckoning. Galley, a sleep cluster of 6 racked bunks. He counted 6. 6 dead crew somewhere if the rest of the math held. A small bridge with the dust thick across the consoles. He did not stop on the bridge. The bridge was somebody else's job. He had not been hired to find the dead Vask. He had been hired to recover a component. There were personal things lashed down everywhere. A scuffed eating bowl in a netted bracket by the bridge door. A child's drawing inked onto a square of hull cloth hung above the navigator's station, lashed at 4 corners with bright cord. A meal locker that opened automatically as he passed it. Vacuum saver mechanism still working off ambient field charge. To display a row of dehydrated portions, neatly arranged, 6 of them. 6. He kept moving. The component bay was 3 decks down, behind a hatch labeled in Vask glyphs, and below them, again in the same patient compact standard, Stasis Bay 1, access by manifest only. The manifest authority belonged to a crew that wasn't here to grant it. He used the crack tool. The bay was small, 1 unit, older than he expected. Inheritance pattern surface ornament across the housing. Layered, no current cultural meaning. The kind of patina that suggests manufacture by something that is no longer here. It was reading cold. Right diagnostic, right indicator, right output level. It was running. For 9 months at minimum by the wreck's known death date. For 3 years if his guess about the patina age was right. He looked at the housing for a long second. The component should not be running because there should be nothing left to keep cold. The job was to recover it intact and inert. The clade had paid for inert. He pried the housing. The vial sat in the center of an inner cradle, single, small, Vask-marked, no larger than his thumb. It had been kept at temperature for as long as the unit had been running. He sat down on the deck plate beside the stasis-class housing and thought about the problem for a long minute. The contract said inert. The clade wanted the unit dead. If he closed the housing, marked it up, and ferried it back to the cutter with the unit still running, Erie would know in the first scan. The recovery rights specified inert handover. A running unit at delivery was a breach. Brokers did not breach. If he killed the unit before extraction, pulled the input feed, let the coal dissipate, let the vial come up to ambient, he would deliver to spec and retire half his debt. He sat with that for another long minute. The vial was a small object. He did not know what was in it. He did not know who had put it there. He knew 6 dead Vask were somewhere on this ship, and that the meal locker had still been counting them as 6. He decided he was not going to kill it. The next question was the only one that mattered. How long could he keep the vial cold without the housing? The vial was small. The housing was, in cubic terms, mostly empty space wrapped around a tiny cradle. The actual thermal mass he needed to preserve was the vial and roughly a thumb's worth of cradle around it. He needed to move that thumb's worth of mass, intact at its current temperature, from inside the housing to inside something else. Then he needed the something else to hold the cold the whole way home. The housing back to the cutter back to the orbital to the docking bay. There he could put the vial into a reach-grade cold lockup and pretend none of this had happened. That worked out to about 8 hours from this moment if everything went smoothly. His crack tool said the vial was running at minus 112. The hull steel of this transport, where it was nearest open vacuum, was at about minus 150. He had a thermal differential available if he could route it. He inventoried what was on his belt. Cracked tool, no use for cold work. Vask multi-tool, micro drill, cutter, magnetic pulse, 6 other functions he used less often, not a thermal device, but hole patches, standard reach vacuum patches, cheap, 3 of them in his thigh pouch, designed to seal a breach with expanding inert foam that set in about 10 seconds. Inert foam was an insulator. That was not what it was for. That was a side effect that anybody who'd ever held a patch bulkhead in a cold corridor knew. He could build a small chamber from the foam. He had done weirder things. He had done weirder things in worse conditions. The trick was not the chamber. The trick was the heat sink. He looked at the multi-tool. The micro drill function was for emergency manual fastening. Drilling a screw hole in an alloy bulkhead, the drill bit was hardened. It would, if he set it to its slowest rotation and stabilized it well, cut a narrow channel through a reach hole patch's metal substrate without rupturing the foam pocket on either side. He went out into the corridor with his shoulder lamp, found a section of bulkhead that he was reasonably sure backed onto open vacuum, and put his hand against it. The cold bit through the suit glove inside 2 seconds. Good. He cut a 6-centimeter square out of the bulkhead with the multi-tool's cutter. The square came free with a faint pop as the cold metal lost its hold on the surrounding panel. He carried it back to the stasis bay. It was still very cold. He laid the cold steel square on the deck plate beside the open housing. He took out a vacuum patch. Vacuum patches were 2-layer, an outer flexible skin and an inner foam pocket. He scored the outer skin with the multi-tool's cutter, just enough to peel it back from a small section. The foam underneath, dormant, was a pale gray crumb pack waiting for an activator pull. He needed a chamber, not a seal. He folded the patch around the cold steel square such that the steel became the patch's floor. He pulled the activator. The foam expanded around the edges of the square and set, building a thumb-deep cavity walled by foam and floored by cold steel. He set the multi-tool to micro drill, slowest setting. He braced it. He cut a single 1-millimeter channel from the underside of the steel square through to the outside, a heat sink vent. He sealed the entry point with a dab of patch residue. The cold of the bulkhead would now bleed into the chamber through the steel floor. Any heat the vial gave off would have an exit. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. It was, by the standards of any certified reach environmental kit, an embarrassment. By the standards of a salvage chief working alone in a wreck with what was on his belt, it was a cold keeper.
Yeah, that'll do.
He talked to himself on jobs. He had always talked to himself on jobs. He had once spent 40 hours alone inside a Suul cargo skiff, debating the merits of a sandwich. He picked up the vial. The cradle released it with a small click. A Vask mechanism designed for a Vask hand, but it worked under a human glove if the human was patient about it. He held the vial against the inside of his glove for the half-second it took to move it to the chamber. He set it on the cold steel floor. He pressed the chamber's foam lid down, sealed the upper seam with a second dab of patch material, and watched the diagnostic. The vial held temperature. Good enough. He turned to the housing. Killing the unit was a smaller problem than the one he had just solved. He pulled the input feed, watched the diagnostic indicator drop from cold to neutral to ambient over 40 seconds, and confirmed the unit was inert. He sealed the housing. He marked it for transport. Then he stopped. He looked at the corridor. He had not gone to the bridge. He thought about going to the bridge. He thought about the 6 counted meals and the lashed-down drawing and the meal locker that had still been counting. He thought about an arbitration beacon still pinging on half power, patient after 9 months. He went to the bridge. The Vask captain was in the captain's chair, fastened in, mummified by 9 months of vacuum. The other 5 were in the sleep cluster. He counted. The math held. He did not touch them. He did, however, on his way back through the corridor, take the child's drawing square down, carefully 4 corners, and fold it small and put it inside his suit next to the vial chamber. That was not in the contract either. Walking out felt longer than walking in. He kept the chamber tucked against his chest where his own body heat could not reach it through the suit's insulation. He moved slowly, because moving fast meant breathing fast, and breathing fast meant warming the suit interior, and the chamber was not interested in the suit interior, but he was not interested in finding out where the chamber's tolerance ended. The airlock cycled. He stepped back across the mag seam to his cutter. He cycled in. In the cutter, he set the chamber on the diagnostic shelf, slid the stasis-class housing into the secondary cargo cradle, magged the cradle down, and ran the pre-burn sequence for the trip back to reach orbital 16. The cracked tool said the chamber was holding. He checked once. He checked again. He started the burn. The vast transport receded behind him in the rear cam, its arbitration beacon still pinging the same patient pulse, the same accord that had not come for it, the same accord that had paid Erie's Clade for a refrigerator and not for the 6 dead crew. He thought about that for the first hour of the burn. Then he stopped thinking about it because thinking about it was not going to keep the vial cold. About 3 hours into the burn, the orbital's traffic control patched him through.
Cutter Rao 6. We've got you on approach window. Hari of 6 Voices is in the bay. Asked to be notified on your dock sequence.
Acknowledged. Tell Ari I'm half an hour out.
Already told him.
The comm clicked off. He looked at the chamber on the diagnostic shelf. The chamber was holding. The vial inside it was, as far as he knew, still alive, for whatever value of alive applied to whatever was inside it. He had no idea what he was carrying. He had 30 minutes to figure out what to tell Erie about it. Reach Orbital 16 looked on dock approach the way it always looked, a slowly turning hubcap of dock spurs and pressurized service mast, half the strip lights along the spurs blinking the wrong color because nobody had ordered the replacement strips. The failed docking arm was retracted into its housing now, in a configuration that suggested somebody had finally decided to take it offline rather than wait for it to kill somebody. Hari took that as a small victory for institutional intelligence. He brought the cutter in along the contractor spur, the dock latch caught, pressurization began. He picked up the chamber. The diagnostic said it had held the entire flight. He stepped through the airlock with the stasis-class housing on a small handcart and the chamber held against the chest of his jumpsuit and walked out into the bay. Hari of 6 Voices was waiting at the contract handoff counter, 2 manipulator arms folded against the harness, the asymmetric wear on the front carapace catching the bay's overhead light. The compound visual band tracked Hari from the airlock door to the counter. He set the housing on the counter. Erie's manipulator arms unfolded, ran a scan across the housing, a small, fast pulse, and confirmed the readings to themselves in some Suul internal way that registered as a half-second pause and then a faint, polite, formal pleasantry.
The unit is inert. The contract terms are satisfied. The agreed sum is being applied to your outstanding obligation. Mr. Rao.
Acknowledged.
Erie did not move for a beat. The compound visual band, which had been tracking the housing, tracked instead to the small foam-edged bundle Hari was still holding against his chest. It rested there. It rested there for 2 full seconds longer than any routine scan required. Then it lifted away.
My 6th voice observes that the courtesy of this contract has been performed with greater thoroughness than the contract specified. My 6th voice observes this without comment. The Clade will not require the additional thoroughness in its accounting.
Hari did not move.
Tell your 6th voice. We're square on the housing.
We are square on the housing. Mr. Rao.
Erie turned slowly and walked out of the bay. The contract band on Erie's harness, Hari noticed only now because Irie's 3/4 angle had brought it into the strip light, was a fresh copper rust. It had not been there 3 days ago. Hari did not go back to the contractor lounge. He walked through the service mast on the long route, past the failed and retracted docking arm and the bay crew arguing about whether to scrap the assembly or rebuild it, past a reach maintenance log nobody had updated in 2 weeks, down the service spiral to his own quarters in the contractor block. He let himself in. He set the chamber on the workbench by the cold lockup. He cracked the lockup open. He transferred the vial out of the chamber and into a reach-grade cryo-cradle, set the cradle to the temperature his diagnostic had read in the bay, and sealed the lockup. The diagnostic glowed steady amber. The vial sat in his lockup like it had been waiting there the whole time. He sat down. The lockup hummed. 47% of his debt was off the books. The contract was satisfied. Hari's sixth voice had observed thoroughness, and the clade was not going to require accounting for it. The clade did not know what he had taken, or if it knew, was not going to admit knowing. There was a difference. The difference would matter eventually in a way he could not yet calculate. He took the folded child's drawing square out from inside his suit and put it on the workbench beside the lockup. It was a drawing of a small Vask figure holding what was possibly a star, or possibly a fruit. The cord knots at the four corners were tied in a pattern Hari did not know. He sat with it for a while. He picked up his cracked tool. He pointed it at the lockup. The diagnostic readout settled into its quiet, steady amber. He spoke once, quietly to nobody in the room.
All right, who are you for?
The lockup did not answer. Outside, somewhere on the orbital, the bay crew began the slow work of rebuilding the arm.